others too.
Turning back to you, DA Gascón, you recently did a blue ribbon panel with regards to policing in San Francisco in the wake of the racist texts and some racist images that were circulated throughout the department. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then can you answer the question as to whether or not that sort of panel is needed for prosecution?
Well, I think the second question is easier to answer. I would say yes. I think that we need to also take a deep look at our own work and our offices. But going back to what we did in the Blue Ribbon panel, so as I indicated earlier, we were confronted March of 2015 with a public disclosure of a series of very, very racist and homophobic text messages that were being traded between 14 San Francisco police officers that were being prosecuted federally in a corruption charge. 3 of them were being prosecuted federally. And the federal prosecutor contesting a bail motion of a recently convicted San Francisco sergeant in order to articulate why this person should not be released, he made those text messages public in his filings. And the way that my office found out about it was on the local newspaper, which was very disturbing because the messages actually had started to take place 2 years prior, which had huge implications for my office, especially concerning Brady disclosure obligations, because we have some of these officers were very active in the field, and we knew that there were going to be a lot of cases that were going to be impacted. So initially, I asked our local government for funding to be able to do a look back, and that was denied, and the stated reason was that they were not going to fund one branch of the local government to go after another, meaning the prosecutors to go after the police, and that was stated to the local media. And given that we did not have the resources to do this kind of work, we came to the conclusion that we needed outside help, and that became basically I went out to 3 very respected California judges, one a local, one a federal, and one a former California Supreme Court justice, and asked if they would be willing to put together this blue ribbon panel. They did. Then we recruited 7 major law firms to actually staff the work in 5 law schools, and this was an incredible work. It took about 1.5 years ago. It was recently published, in fact, about 4 weeks ago, and I highly recommend to all of you, you can go into our website and just go and look for the Blue Ribbon Panel report, and you can take a look at it. It has 81 recommendations, about 72 findings, but without getting into very complex issues, the bottom line is that the fear that I had that this was not just simply a localized to 14 people, and the reason why I suspected that, by the way, from the very beginning is the normalized way these officers were talking to one another about things that most of us would find very, very repulsive. It gave me the belief that this had to be more acceptable to others than just simply 14 people, which the panel certainly came to that conclusion. And we had to begin to take a look at about 4,000 police reports, about 1,600 prosecutions were compromised. We're still looking at those prosecutions, by the way. We had to dismiss a large number of cases, and we're still trying to come to grips with the impact of that first wave of racist text messages. And then about 1 year later, we again, through another criminal investigation involving 3 other police officers, where we decided to do a data dump on their personal phones, we found again a whole series of very racist text messages, which led to a second wave of investigations and case dismissals, and frankly, a comment by many in the community saying, well, if every time that we do a data dump on a phone from a San Francisco police officer, we're likely to find this, and this is only a gateway through a criminal investigation independent of dealing with racism, what else should be there. And that really kind of, basically created further impetus for this report that was published. We're hoping now, frankly, that most of those recommendations are implemented. Most of them are very straightforward, unlike the other reports that you see in policing that are aspirational. This is not an aspirational report. This is really a nuts and bolts. This is a problem. This is what you need to do to correct it. There are also recommendations for my office, which goes to your question, Melba. The district attorney should also take a look at it. So we are going to begin to do some work already, especially around the Brady obligations and other discovery things. But there is no question that I think that the more that we get behind the curtain in our system, the more obvious that it becomes to me that while I do not believe that everybody in the system is maliciously working, to the contrary, I think the majority of us, both in prosecution and policing, are well-intended and trying to do the right things. I think the systems need to be really looked upon. They need to be re-engineered, and the only way that we're going to do this is by admitting that we have a problem, and that the problem is probably a lot larger than most of us care to think about. If this can happen in San Francisco, I guarantee you that it can happen anywhere else.
Thank you. So now, looking at the takeaways, how can we combat implicit bias? I mean, we know that there's a problem. We've talked about concrete examples of implicit bias and looked at the studies across the country. So what can we do to combat implicit bias? What tools and resources are there out there to help us get rid of this problem? Seeing that it's, malleable, as Wayne put it.
Well, I'll start. I know that my colleagues up here will have a lot of good suggestions too. One of the things to consider is that there's been a lot of research on this, and it's very good and it's very solid. It's out there 10 to 20 years, as I said in my introductory remarks, and it's evolving as research does, but it has told us some very interesting things and given us some good concrete suggestions. One of the ways in which some of the researchers disagree is whether or not it's actually possible to de-bias somebody. And I think the bulk of the opinion is that we don't know anything that does that. But some are more willing to say, no, there are these things that where we've seen it in our experiments where you can do that. So I'm certainly not qualified to resolve that. I would just say that where there's agreement, you can find things that you can do. And I'll just name 4 of them very quickly, because I know there'll be others, as ways of preventing implicit bias from impacting behavior. Number 1 is you have to train yourself to doubt your objectivity. All right? Everybody in here feels that they are fair, that they are a good person, that they have egalitarian beliefs that are sincerely held. Great, I feel that too. Doubt your objectivity nonetheless, because the essence of implicit bias is that it's there and it can be operating even if you think those things about yourself in a very sincere, experience-based way. So you have to doubt your objectivity. You have to train yourself to have that thought as a prosecutor, as a lawyer. And I said the same thing, I want you to know, to the federal defenders when I trained them at their national convention just a couple of months ago. Number 2, think about the working conditions under which you make crucial decisions. I know that many very busy prosecutors' offices, I mean, you're just staying on top of that pile of files, right? You have to put yourself in a position where you can think about the decisions that you make, that they're not kind of snap judgments. You have a lot of experience at this point. You've seen a million of these cases, and so that's where it happens, actually. So slow down to the extent that your situation allows you to. And if it doesn't allow you to slow down when you're making critical decisions, something has to change, I would say. And you should be talking to your supervisors, your people who run the office, and pointing this out. 3, this will not surprise you because we've all talked about this up here, count. Yes, it's true that very few DA's offices have the kind of sophisticated systems that would be ideal, but at least get a start. Start building that system. Start looking around for the tools you could use that would put you in a position where you can say, here are our most important 6, 8, whatever it is, points of discretion, and here's what we see as a pattern of decision-making in our office, because that is the only thing that can really tell you what's really going on, whether you realize it or not. So count. Get that data stream going. And last but not least, I'll come back just ever so briefly to a point I just made. The more intergroup contact and interaction that there is, whether within your office or for you personally, the better. These things take time, they take relationships. It's so important. And the more contact you have with people from other groups, the better you're going to be able to simply resist, even maybe in ways that you won't even detect, but your implicit biases will not control your actions. And the bottom line is that that's what this is about. You don't want those controlling you. You want your conscious beliefs to come to the fore. We know that some of these things that I've mentioned will help that to be the case.
And I guess to focus on your first point, which was mine also, in terms of your own self-reflection. Okay, and a concrete example, I was sitting in my office one day and someone had sent me an inappropriate ethnic-related email joke about stupidity. And I read it, and without thinking, I blurted out, "Man," and I thought black people had it bad. Thank God I'm not Polish. And one of my favorite sergeants was walking by my office, stepped into my office. "McKenzie, I'm Polish. I didn't think you were that type of person." Okay, so no matter how fair and good a person as you think you are, what David said is extremely, extremely important. Remember, I'll say it again, we all have, I'm not going to say biases, I'm going to say implicit prejudices and preferences, and it impacts everything we do on a daily basis. Education, right? Being aware, and that's just a first step. Your cognitive load, something that David sort of alluded to, right? Decreasing the amount and the complexity of information you have to process in any given time frame. Slowing down, something I know our system is going to have a real problem with, but also decreasing caseloads for judges, defenders, and prosecutors, where it gives each system actor an opportunity to slow down. Mindfulness, right? That's purposefully focusing on a task at hand. It means taking the blindfold off. Again, someone said something earlier about justice is blind. That's part of the problem. You know, I'll go back to that example that I gave you about the African American women, where once that was identified, they actually started paying attention to it. And what resulted was a more fair outcome. Again, the exposure to counter stereotypes, right, that David mentioned. And sometimes we've got to look to other fields for examples on how to do this. A prime example would be, was it the New York Harmonic, but a huge orchestra. And problem is, for some reason, women musicians just weren't getting a fair shake. And they went to a blind audition process where any musician had to audition behind a screen. So the selectors didn't know the gender or the race. You can guess what happened, right? All of a sudden, former women were performing higher in their auditions and joining the symphony.
You know, I think most of it has been said. I would only add one thing, and I think is that you have to create systems that ensure that implicit bias is going to be part of the analysis of the work. And those systems need to be somewhat mechanized. It has to, you have to force it so that if people are going to divert from it, they have to explain why they're moving away from that. And I know that often flies in the face of, we like to believe that, our intuition and our professional know-how and our years of experience are always guiding us in the right direction. But I think there's a lot of evidence that us, like anybody else, like medical doctors and others, often our intuition may not necessarily be leading us in the right way. So I think that you have to create systems that are fairly strict as to how you're going to look at a case to ensure that these areas are certainly entertained. And then if you're going to be jumping away from there, then you need to have maybe a second level of review.
And now, what role does training play in the offices across the country with regards to implicit bias? Is that something that would be an effective way at reducing or at least making prosecutors more self-aware? And what form should that training take? Should it be monthly? Should it be annually? Should it be only when you're first hired? What are your thoughts on that? And I'm directing that to the entire panel.
I think training is important, but I think that we have to be careful. I'm seeing a trend out there that we're now are doing implicit bias training, right? And there is a whole spectrum of the quality of that training that is going on. And I'm listening to some of my peers that believe that the way to deal with this problem simply, I'm going to have, I'm going to do annual training or I'm going to do it whatever, and that's going to somehow inoculate my office. And I'm only going to go back again to the systems. If you don't create systems, and if you think training alone, and again, sometimes often of questionable quality of training, that's going to cure you, I think you're heading in the wrong direction.
Yes, I would agree. I do regular training in this field for lots of different types of outfits: police, prosecutors' offices, defenders, as I said. And the first thing I tell the people who call me up and say, would you be willing to do this for me, and how long does your session typically take? I say, well, hour and a half, and plenty of time for Q&A, and that, 2 hours. At the first time I talk to them, I say, I cannot do for you in 2 hours what you need to do to solve this problem. I can raise awareness. That's the first step always, and I'll do a good job with that, but this has to be something that where you invest in the systems and you make sure that ethic is carried out throughout the practice of your office all the time.
I echo those thoughts. I think that training is just one important part of it. I think it's an essential part, but also the quality, right? If it's that 1.5, 2 hour sensitivity, hold hands, kumbaya, we're wasting our time. It's just not effective. I think I had mentioned the criminal justice section. We actually created a cultural competency curriculum. And when done properly, it's actually a 2-day train the trainers, where you go through different modules, and you're actually doing hardcore interactive hands-on practices as well. And we decided to make it a train the trainers model only because we understood that, in the office you need someone there who is going to constantly be able to perform this type of training. But then, again, I'll emphasize what the DA said. You still need the systems in place. You still need to think about the complexion of your office. All of those things are all part and parcel of trying to deal with implicit bias effectively.
And the last question before I turn it over to question and answer. What can prosecutors do to self-reflect and determine what their biases are so that they can now act accordingly? And I say this in the framework of prosecutors, but of course all of us in this room, so that we know that when we're going forward in our daily activities, we're not treating people improperly or affecting people's lives improperly based on a bias.
I really think that we have to question ourselves. And I'm going to tell you this through my own personal experiences. I've been in this business for about 30 years. I started in policing. I was the chief of police in 2 major cities, one in Arizona and then here in San Francisco, and then I've been the DA here for 6 years. And I've always been clear that there are bad apples in every organization, and I always understood and dealt with problems that were created by people that did horrible things in policing and sometimes in prosecutions. But I have to tell you that the last 2.5 or 3 years in San Francisco, as we embarked in the investigation, well, first of all, the text messages and then dealing with that, I had to do a complete reevaluation of the work and how the work is done. And I think it really allowed me to, for the first time, start questioning the system and questioning myself. And I believe that I'm at a much better place today. And I would only say, and I'm saying this again, I'm talking about my own personal experience, I think it's very healthy to question ourselves. I think that the more self-doubt that we have in this area, the more thoughtful that we're going to be, and at the end of the day, the work that we're going to do is going to be a much better work. And certainly, if you're in a position of leadership, I would strongly recommend that you start questioning all the things that you believed in before, and sort of begin from scratch and start building from that. I think it's very healthy.
Couldn't say it better. Doubt your objectivity.
Ditto.